Are you struggling to get your video color balance or exposure just right in post-production? Maybe your footage looks too bright, too dark, or perhaps it's a little bit blue or a little bit warm. What's the secret, you ask? Using scopes in Adobe Premiere Pro. In this video, I'll show you how to read the 4 key scopes, a histogram, RGB parade, waveform, and a vectorscope to perhaps correct small mistakes in your footage, balance your colors and exposure, and maintain consistency across your shots. Let's get started. Okay, so here we are in Adobe Premiere Pro. Right now I am in the editing workspace or the editing page, and we are going to want to move to the color workspace or the color page. And how you do that is you go to this little button on the top right hand side of the interface. You click on that and then you select color, and it's going to bring you into the color workspace. On the right here, we've got the Lumetri color tab, and on the left we have our scopes. Top left is the waveform, top right is the vectorscope. Bottom left is the histogram, and the bottom right is the RGB parade. And I'm going to go through these scopes one by one with you and just explain essentially how to read them today. Just in case you're not seeing these scopes, what you would need to do is go up to Window and select Lumetri scopes, and they should come up here. They could also be hidden in one of these tabs here. So you just have to move over to Lumetri scopes. Okay, so right now we're looking at the histogram, and it's good for reading exposure and tonal range of your image. It's a graph that represents the brightness levels of your image. It runs usually from left to right, but in Premiere Pro, it's kind of running from the bottom to the top, the bottom being your shadows and the top being your highlights over there. Obviously, midtones are in the center here as well. Okay, so a well-balanced histogram typically stretches across the full range of kind of the image without heavy spikes at either end. If you see a large spike at the bottom or the top, or on the left or the right, if you're working in another piece of software, you're essentially either crushing your shadows or overexposing your highlights. And while the histogram doesn't show where in the frame these values occur, it gives you a quick overview of tonal distribution, which is crucial when using alongside other scopes. So its strengths are, it's a quick way to check your exposure levels, and it helps identify clipping in your shadows and your highlights. It does have a few weaknesses though, because it doesn't show where in the image the brightness levels exist. It just shows you kind of a percentage or the amount of pixels at that tonal range or that exposure level. And it also doesn't provide color balance information. Okay, the next scope that I would like to take you through is the RGB parade. So I'm going to right click on here and select RGB parade, and then I'm going to right click again and just turn the histogram off. So an RGB parade scope, as you may have guessed, is good for checking color balance. So it shows you the red, green, and blue channels separately, and it allows you to check if there are color casts essentially on your image. And if one channel is significantly higher than the other, you'll know, for instance, that there's maybe a blue color cast. And aligning these RGB channels ensures that you have accurate color balance or white balance and maintains true to life colors. Now you read it from the bottom to the top, so shadows to highlights. And this trace in the middle, the graphic representation is called the trace. You never want it to touch this top line, and you never want to touch this bottom line either. If it touches the bottom line, you're crushing the shadows. If the trace touches the top line, you are overexposing your highlights. So what are the strengths of an RGB parade scope? It can easily help you identify color balance or white balance issues, and it helps you correct color casts if there are any. Perhaps one weakness of an RGB parade scope is it can be a little bit overwhelming if you don't know how to read it. And what I'm actually going to do quickly is just show you. I'm just going to scroll through this image, and you'll see there's a person moving in the background, and you'll actually be able to see them moving from left to right. So it's actually also showing you exactly where these exposure values are in the image, left to right. So if I'm just scrolling through there, you can see that person moving over there. And then the third scope that I want to show you is the waveform monitor. And that helps you to measure brightness across the frame. It maps your brightness values out across the frame. Unlike a histogram, it gives you the spatial information. So if I scroll through the image again, you can see that that person that's moving, you can see them moving over here, and it's telling you exactly where those brightness levels are. You measure it from the brightness levels from 0 to 100. So you never want the trace to go above this line, and you never want it to go below this line, because if you're below this line, you're crushing the shadows. And if you're above this 100 line, you are overexposing your highlights. And you would essentially use this waveform, and it's currently in a setting called Luma. So if you right click here and you go to waveform type, you can switch it between RGB And Luma, I like to use it in Luma because that then allows you to focus on brightness, and you can use the RGB parade scope to monitor your color levels. And it's essentially great for checking broadcast safe exposure levels. And then the last scope I want to take you through is the Vectorscope. So I'm going to select the Vectorscope here, and I'm going to turn off the waveform. So a Vectorscope is essentially used for checking color saturation and hue. The midpoint here represents absolute white. And the further you move away from the center, the more saturated the color is becoming. So you can see right now that this trace is moving towards red and yellow. It's a slightly warm image. And there's 6 reference targets here, essentially: red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. So it's essentially a color wheel, and it's allowing you to check the hues in your image and the saturation of those hues. When you're looking at a Vectorscope, if a color leans too far in one direction, you probably have a little bit of a color cast in the image. You should also notice that there's a line here, and that's called the skin tone line. And it essentially guides you in correcting skin tones as well. So you can line up the trace of someone's skin with the skin tone line in order to ensure that their skin tones are correct. And one last thing you can do here is to keep an eye on the saturation to prevent oversaturation and prevent things from essentially looking unnatural. You want to kind of keep this trace underneath this shape here, because as you push past that, saturation becomes far too much and it can look somewhat unnatural. So a Vectorscope is the best tool for monitoring color saturation and skin tones. It helps maintain color consistency across shots. There's no brightness or spatial information, however. You can't pinpoint where in the image that color shift is actually happening. You would perhaps need to use an RGB parade scope for that, but it's a great scope to use to check hue and color saturation. So as you can see, each scope has its strengths and its weaknesses, but when you use them together, they can give you complete control over your image. Remember, a histogram helps with exposure, an RGB parade scope ensures color balance, a waveform keeps your brightness levels in check, and a Vectorscope manages saturation and hue. You should use these tools consistently throughout your color process to achieve accurate, visually appealing, and technically correct footage. And if you're ready to take the next step, check out this next video where I demonstrate real-world color correction techniques in Premiere Pro. I'll see you there.